is, what does Lazarus do in today's story? So Lazarus is going to operate as a great evangelist, in a sense. There's lots of people that are coming to see Lazarus because they're interested. Well, what's Lazarus doing in this story? 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honour. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well, for on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. So there's a lot going on there with other characters as well, with Martha, with Mary, with the Jews coming to see Lazarus. But if we just think first about Lazarus, what did he do? What was it that Lazarus was doing in today's story?
Didn't do anything. Doesn't even say he was there, does he? It says it was his house.
Right, but didn't do anything, right? That's amazing. Didn't do anything. And yet Lazarus points to Jesus. Right? Can you imagine people saying, let's go and see Lazarus. Let's go and see this man. And imagine someone doesn't know the story. And they come along and they see Lazarus. What would they see Lazarus doing? As Maureen saying, not a lot. Imagine them being like, this Lazarus, what does he do? Is he a great football player? Or is he a great comedian? No. Well, what does he do? Is he a great athlete? Is he really good at his job? He's alive! Exactly! That was the very point I was going to get to.
Sorry.
He's living, he's breathing. And in a sense, what an inspiration, right? People look at Lazarus there and go, oh, look, he's laying down. What a top bloke, right? But he's doing living. He's doing breathing. In the beginning of the story, it starts with, there was a man who lived, right? Lazarus lived in this place. Lazarus points to Jesus because the first and primary act of witness for any Christian is to be truly alive because of Jesus. That's his witness. He's alive, but he didn't used to be. Jesus gives new life. He's there, he's reclining, he's eating with Jesus. Why? Because he's alive. There's a difference. There's a difference Jesus has made to him. And those that looked at Lazarus not knowing the story might not see the difference properly. But those that knew what he was like, well, they see a difference. They know how it was with Lazarus. They knew that Jesus gives new life. Lazarus is pointing to Jesus. What does Jesus do? Right? Because he does a bit more. What I'd like is a bit of participation. If I say crowd, I want to cheer. Hey, right? It's something that's suggestive of a crowd. If there are yellow words on screen, it'd be helpful if you could read them. That's often the crowd parts. If there are items which are underlined, I'd like you to look out for them on the table and give those a wave. The next day, the great crowd that had come for the festival heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and went out to meet him, shouting,
Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.
Blessed is the King of Israel. Have we got any crowns? We've got a couple. King of Israel. Jesus found a young donkey. Can you find a young donkey? Any young donkeys to be found? He found a young donkey and sat on it, as it is written. Do not be afraid, daughter Zion.
See, your king is coming. See, not the donkey's colt.
At first, his disciples did not understand all this. Only after Jesus was glorified did they realize that these things had been written about him, and these things had been done to him. Now the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. Many people, because they had heard that he had performed this sign, went out to meet him. So the Pharisees said to one another, see, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole crowd has gone after him. Why a donkey? Lazarus is in a sense pointing to Jesus by his very existence, by his very life, his living and his breathing. They're pointing to Jesus, and Jesus is there. And Jesus says in this section, not a word. Not a word, no sermon to the crowd, right? Not with words anyway. The thing that is pointed out is that Jesus rides a donkey. So it's worth asking, why a donkey? Why is he doing that? Any ideas? Humility.
The generals and kings always ride on the biggest and toughest and baddest horses.
Marvellous.
A sign of peace, showing you coming peace.
Absolutely.
Not to find.
There's peace there. So Jesus.
No buses.
No buses. He'd missed his bus, the number 3 into Jerusalem. He had to get the nearest donkey. So, yes, he won't do a big horse. He is the King of Kings. He's being celebrated and welcomed by the crowd, right? But he says he's going to be a different kind of king. He's not going to be the military kind of king. He's not coming in waving a sword. He's not on a chariot. He's not on a war horse. He's on a donkey. He's there to make peace. I'd like us to think in this section about, do we see Jesus? Sir, they said, we would like to see Jesus. Which sounds very good as far as it goes. But the next section suggests that they're not getting their request. They want to see Jesus. They are Greeks, rather, from the Decapolis, probably. So leftover invaders from Alexander the Great who have settled. And they would like to see Jesus. They would like to hear more of him. Jesus has been living and preaching around that area. And they've given him a reception. And they want to hear from him more. They're part of this crowd, this celebratory occasion. They've welcomed him as king. They've welcomed him perhaps as a lecturer, as a visiting rabbi, as a scholar, even if he wasn't a formal scholar. They visited him, they welcomed him as that visiting speaker. Jesus is celebrated. That's who they want to see. They want to see Jesus, the celebrated one. But Jesus' answer suggests that they don't know what's going to happen. They don't know what's going to happen next. Jesus replied, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. But it's not going to be like they think. He's going to be celebrated. He's going to be exalted. He's going to be glorious. But it's not at all how they think. The way that's going to happen is not through a grand preaching tour. Jesus starts to rebuff their expectations. Very truly, I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. I'm not going to have great fruit among the Greeks by going and preaching there and avoiding the cross. No. Anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. He's not going to have great success by holding on, by grasping on to the life he now has, to the cheers of the crowd, because he knows they need a deeper help than that. They need to live like Lazarus lived. They need a life from Jesus. And he knows the way to give that life is to fall to the ground and die, is to be that seed. Jesus is going to be lifted up on a cross. That's how he's going to be exalted. That's how he's going to be magnified. He came to die for them. He came on their behalf. Do we see Jesus like this? Or do we see Jesus like the Greeks? We want to see Jesus. We want to see the teacher. We want to see the one who's being celebrated as king. In this country, there's a lot of people who do not celebrate Jesus as king. Do we in that still see his glory? Do we in that still see the one who died for us? I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people, all kinds of people to myself, including these Greeks who are trying to see me now, says Jesus. He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. He was going to die a death that was going to be regarded as shameful, and yet for his people glorious, because he was prepared to do it for them. Do we see Jesus taking on death in what he does, even though he's lifted up cruelly? Do we see Jesus exalted through shame? A brave warrior, yet refusing to defend himself. He's fighting his battle by taking all the wrong on himself to protect those who put their trust in him. Suffering in their place, a substitutionary death, a death in the place of others. What bravery! Have we seen Jesus? Do we see Jesus now like this? Do we know this is the one who rescues us? Now, there were three other characters earlier on in the story, and we saw that they had a great change from Jesus. We've spoken about Lazarus. He was alive because of Jesus, but the other two had a great change as well. Martha, it says quite simply in the opening of 12 that Martha served. It doesn't go into great lengths about Martha. It just says, now Martha served. Isn't that interesting? Because we have another story about Martha, don't we? Another story where Martha was serving. But she didn't just simply serve. She had a go at her sister. But in this story, there's been a change. Martha is able to serve without looking for glory herself, or without trying to get someone else in trouble, or have a squabble. There was none of that. Martha saw something of Jesus, and she served without getting haughty this time. And then we see Mary. Mary so devoted to Jesus, because Mary had been forgiven so much. And the one who is forgiven much loves much. And she loved much. She saw Jesus for who Jesus was, and she loved him. Mary saw Jesus had forgiven her and changed her, and she was greatly devoted to Jesus. She was prepared to give up her most valuable possessions. She was prepared to be there at Jesus' feet. She loved Jesus because she'd seen Jesus for who he was. And then Lazarus. Lazarus saw Jesus. Lazarus saw Jesus calling him out the tomb after he'd been dead. Lazarus saw Jesus. And though we never see a single word spoken by Lazarus in the Gospels, not one word, we see that Lazarus loved Jesus and Jesus loved Lazarus. Jesus was the one who called him to life. So Lazarus stayed with Jesus, ate with him, followed him, walked with him, lived because of him. John Piper, in a book, Seeing and Savouring Jesus Christ, says this: seeing and savouring Jesus Christ, valuing him, seeing him as worthwhile, as the highest treasure. Seeing and savouring Jesus Christ is the most important seeing and savouring you will ever do. Eternity hangs on it. So my aim, in that book he was writing, is that you see him as solid truth and savour him with great joy. Because it's one thing to serve God just out of obligation, and it's quite another flavour, quite another timbre. We become a different instrument of the Lord when we serve him with joy, with happiness. So John Piper's aim is that we see him as solid truth and savour him with great joy. When I speak of seeing Jesus Christ, I don't mean seeing with the eyes of your head, but the eyes of your heart. When we see with our spiritual eyes, we see the truth and beauty and value of Jesus Christ for what they really are. If you don't prize him above all things, you haven't apprehended his true worth. So, the question, have we seen Jesus? Do we see Jesus now? Do we see Jesus? Are we reminded of what he does in the symbols? Because we know what he's done for us. What impact does that have? Does it change us like it did Mary and Martha and Lazarus? It changed them. Does it impact us? Back towards the start of the Christian church, probably about 20 years after John was written, something like that. This is from AD 111 to 113 or so. There was a governor of a province called Pliny the Younger, and they were persecuting Christians at that time. So the emperor, I believe, wanted them dead. Anyway, there was persecution going on, and this particular chap was a governor. So Pontius Pilate is referred to as a governor in various places, though there are other titles that are perhaps better. But he was going to persecute these Christians. And he said that he used to put it to them whether they were or were not Christians. That's the first part. Are you a Christian? Will you deny the name of Jesus? Is these charges true? To such as profess that they were, I put the inquiry a second or a third time. And actually, it's quite easy going if you're a policeman and the charge is being a Christian, right? Because you just ask people. you just ask them. And if they are, then look, they've got to be asked a second and a third time before they'll possibly even consider saying no, right? And he threatened them with the supreme penalty, with death, because they weren't denying it. And those who persisted, he ordered executed. So that's that governor. But he was interested in what they were doing. He was interested in whether they were actually doing something worthy of death. He wanted to find out what these Christians were actually about. And he found out that they'd been in the habit of meeting together on a stated day before sunrise, and of offering words to Christ as to a God, also of binding themselves by an oath not to commit thefts or robberies or adulteries, not to break their word, not to repudiate deposits when called upon. These ceremonies having been gone through, they were in the habit of separating and again meeting for the purpose of taking food. Food that is of an ordinary and innocent kind. So we found this was the testimony of Christians. This is what they were doing. They were meeting together and pledging themselves to be honest. And then they ate food together. What criminals they were. So I love that that's an old impact of what the church was doing. The church was grouping together, and even when they were going to be killed for it, they were still going to offer words of prayer and worship to Christ. And even though they were going to be killed for it, they were still going to be honest. Because weren't they really being killed for being honest? Because if you get asked, are you a Christian? And then, are you a Christian? Are you a Christian? If you keep going like this, I'm going to kill you. Wouldn't it be much easier to be dishonest? Wouldn't that be in a sense a protection, or feel like a protection? I just lie. But no. Because their crime was they were meeting together and pledging to be honest before Christ. The truth had such an impact in them. Real, solid truth. That's great impact. And it's because they saw great things in Christ.